The night she left, the house learned how to whisper his name back to him. Not aloud, plaster doesn't have a throat, but in the shuffle of vents, the click of settling wood, the way the refrigerator hummed one note higher as if trying to soothe a fever the body hadn't admitted yet. David stood in the doorway longer than anyone should stand and watch a taillight turn a corner. Even after it vanished, the red stain clung to the inside of his vision like a finger pressed too hard on a screen. He closed the door and the latch sounded ceremonial, like a judge's gavel in a courtroom where the only witness was a ring of keys. It is said the darkest moments reveal our truest selves, but the first truth he found was small and graceless. He didn't know where to put his hands. They hung there, stupid, as if the body had been handed a script in a language it couldn't read. The living room, still warmed by the ghost of her laughter, made him furious by existing exactly as it had that morning. Throw blanket unrumpled, coffee rings perfect as eclipses on the coaster, a novel she'd left spine up on the arm of the couch like a bird with a broken back. He touched none of it. He sat in the armchair he never sat in because it was her chair and tried it on like a jacket that didn't belong to him. The silence pressed close. He used to call their home loud with gentle things. Kettle, radio, soft footsteps, the muttered commentary they shared at the sink like old sportscasters calling a game only they cared about. Now the quiet was a creature that dragged its belly along the floor, slow and invasive. He breathed through his mouth to keep from tasting it. He made it to the bathroom and splashed cold water over his face, water that smelled faintly of metal and the bruise of chlorine, and the mirror cut him down to the person he'd spent years editing away. A tired man with eyes that refused to focus on themselves for more than a heartbeat. He tried to sleep in the bed that night and failed, so he lay on the rug in the living room because it felt less like an accusation and more like a temporary campsite where no one had the right to ask for explanations. The ceiling fan cut the air into obedient slices. He held his phone over his face and scrolled through photos that had not yet resigned from their job. The ones where she laughed with her head thrown back and that small vein in her temple showed, because joy has its own maps. The ones where the world tilted toward them as if they were the hinge everything swung on. He put the phone down. He considered flinging it into the laundry basket like a metaphor. He did not. Days blurred into a strange film played at the wrong frame rate. He returned to work and let the calendar bully him into pretending there was a normal to return to. He sat in meetings and took notes he would never read because writing made people assume competence. Deadlines were a wad of cotton in his ears. At his desk, the screen glowed and he glowed back, a pair of aquariums maintaining each other's illusions. Coworkers passed by with encouraging phrases they'd found on coasters or in songs their parents used to play in kitchens. Time heals this too, you'll come out stronger. He smiled the way you smile when a child hands you a drawing that is mostly sky. At night, anger came like weather. He would be buttering toast, how pedestrian, how blessedly boring, and suddenly he was a cliff face getting punched by waves that had learned his name and were saying it wrong on purpose. How could she? How could anyone trade a life with intact grocery lists and ridiculous inside jokes for a mirage, a promise rehearsed by a stranger who had the nerve to be charming? The rage lived under the grief like bedrock. He didn't know what to do with it, so he did what the body knows. He moved. The gym at 7 a.m. doesn't forgive, and that's why it works. He signed up without ceremony and began a routine that made his spine remember it had a job other than shivering. The first morning, he forgot headphones and lifted in silence, the clang and thunk of plates like an honest language that didn't ask him to explain himself. Sweat made him human again. The soreness 2 days later was a letter from a far country that began, "You have not died," signed, quadriceps. He cooked eggs without overthinking the symbolism, chopped tomatoes, burned the first piece of toast because defiance has to start somewhere. He made small vows that felt like truce agreements. No eating standing up, no sleeping on the rug as if penance were a bed, no texting her unless what he typed was something he would say if she were a stranger who deserved kindness and not a history book with annotations in the margins. He broke these rules and then kept them and then broke them again because progress is not a staircase. It's a field, and sometimes you choose the path and sometimes the grass chooses you. On a sunshot Sunday, he ran in the park until his chest drummed yes, 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 not to her, not to anyone, just to air. Friends came with casseroles of words. "We love you," said Mara, whose voice always collapsed the distance between pity and respect. "We are not here to fix," said Sam. "We are here to sit." They sat. They watched a film that knew how to be quiet where it mattered, after they washed dishes in choreography. Pass, rinse, dry, stack, domestic liturgy with better theology than any of them had learned on purpose. "You don't have to narrate this," Mara added softly. "You can just live it and tell us later." He nodded and hated that he cried and loved that he could. The camera he'd boxed up months ago came out like a shy animal lured with a slice of apple. He recharged the battery, cleaned the lens with the care of a keeper returning to his post, and went outside into a city that didn't know it was auditioning for mercy. He took pictures of ordinary light doing extraordinary work. A pigeon with the arrogance of a god stepping through a triangle of sun. The way a bus stop advertisement reflected across a puddle, so the model's grin looked like it belonged to the water. Click, click. Each shutter felt like a measured breath. Each image was a way of saying, "Look what remains." He learned where the morning slid its first coins onto the lake. He sat on a bench and practiced not naming every ache. Across the water, a heron held still with the intensity of a monk. He tried to mirror it and failed and tried again. The meditation app offered him the voice of a person who had never yelled, and he rescented it and kept listening. "Notice the thought," it said, "then let it pass like a boat." Some boats are party barges with horns and neon and stubborn friends on the deck shouting stay. He let them pass anyway. One evening, after a day in which nothing hurt more than a paper cut, and he felt guilty for calling that victory, a knock came. It echoed down the hall like a stranger calling his childhood nickname from a dark street. He opened the door and found a version of the past he did not have language for. She was smaller, yes. Grief and regret are tailors with steady hands, but that wasn't it. Her gaze had lost its habit of skipping past the present to a future she could arrange with a glint and a laugh. "David," she said, and the syllables were a confession. He stepped back without inviting, and she stepped in without assuming. In the living room, she hovered near the arm of the couch as if it were a witness she needed to swear in. "It wasn't what I expected," she said, voice already breaking, and he hated how swiftly his body catalogued the curve of her mouth when it formed apology. "He wasn't you." The phrase hung between them, fragile as soap film. She cried in earnest then, not the showy kind of crying that asks to be admired for its vulnerability, but the boring, honest kind that makes the face red and the nose raw. "I made a mistake," she said, the words stumbling in their rush to be believed. He sat, which felt like more than he was capable of and less than she wanted. "I know," he said. "It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't not. It was a fact that had already been admitted into evidence." She spoke in torrents that jumped their banks. The illusion, the emptiness, the kitchen in a new apartment that never smelled like home no matter how many onions she sautéed. "It was a mirage," she said, and he remembered the way heat makes highways look like they're promising rivers. "I thought I was walking toward water. I wasn't." He wanted to ask 1,000 questions that would change nothing. "When did you know? Did he know? Did you keep the mug I bought you? Did you laugh at jokes about me? Did you say my name and mean it like a prayer or a curse?" He asked none. Instead, "Why are you here?" The cruelty of it landed and then revealed itself as mercy, the only door through which any true thing could walk. "To ask," she said, "for a chance to try again, or," and here she closed her eyes, "for the dignity of a no I can live with." He looked at her and saw not a villain, not a saint, just a person who had unmade a life and dragged the ruin to his threshold for inventory. He touched the ridge at the base of his thumb where a knife had nicked him last week slicing rosemary. It had almost healed. He thought of the gym at 7, the late coins of light, the camera blinking like a small, patient animal. He thought of how hard he had worked to speak to himself in ways that didn't bruise. He inhaled. "I hope you find peace," he said, and the sentence wore no armor. It needed none. She sobbed he didn't touch her. He stood and walked to the door because the body understands ritual even when the heart stages a mutiny. She followed. "I did love you," she whispered at the threshold, and he believed her in the way you believe in weather, true while it's happening, not obligated to stay. He nodded. He closed the door. The latch sounded smaller than it had on the night with the tail lights. He leaned his forehead against the wood until the cool made sense of the heat behind his eyes. The house did not applaud. It did not condemn. It resumed its whisper, but softer now, a lullaby for a child who has made it through a fever. David stood in the quiet and noticed the absence wasn't a vacuum anymore. It was a room with windows he could open. He went to the kitchen, set water to boil, waited without tapping his foot. When the kettle sang, it sounded like an invitation and not an alarm. He poured, he sat, he wrapped his hands around the mug. He looked at the armchair and did not flinch. Outside, a siren wailed and receded. Inside, something unclenched. He took a breath and the breath stayed. Morning began with the smallest ceremony. David placed the kettle on the burner, turned the knob until the flame rose with a polite whoosh, and leaned both palms against the counter until his breathing remembered it had a rhythm that belonged to no one else. He'd started writing the steps on a sticky note the first week after she came to the door. Boil, pour, sip, sit. Not because he couldn't remember, but because some days it felt like a kindness to be told exactly what came next. The eucalyptus he'd impulse bought from the corner florist stood in a jar by the window, thin coins of light varnishing each leaf. When he walked past, it released a smell that was clean, astringent, like the air in a room that's just been named. He ate at the table, even when appetite arrived late or not at all. Knife on the right, fork on the left, mug where the ring of heat wouldn't scar the wood. He'd stopped standing at the sink to shovel toast in his mouth like a fugitive. The chair made him accountable to his own hunger. Across the table, an empty chair stared back with the quiet assurance of an uncluttered altar. "You don't need to be filled to matter," he told it once, and felt ridiculous and also strangely steadied, like a man who discovers the echo in his stairwell answers gently and not to judge. Outside, the neighborhood conducted its modest symphony. A bus sighed at the corner, a cyclist's bell chimed like a distant kitchen timer, a dog named after a spice refused to be convinced that leashes honored anyone's freedom. It had rained overnight, and the street shone with the mild conscience rain leaves behind. David locked the door and began his loop. He had chosen a route that touched 3 bodies of water, fountain, canal, lake, as if he could apprentice himself to things that kept moving without needing to be applauded for it. By the fountain he stretched, hamstrings complaining just enough to make him feel alive. By the canal he breathed in the metallic cool. By the lake he ran, a steady, human metronome ticking through a song only he seemed to hear. He kept his phone on Do Not Disturb between 7 and 9. The first time his mother called during those hours, he let it roll to voicemail and later texted, "Alive, loved, jogging." She responded with a photo of the sky over her porch and 3 words, "Proud of you," which landed like a warm hand pressed to the back of his heart. Friends learned the new parameters quickly. "You're not disappearing, you're choosing oxygen," Mara said when he explained that he wouldn't be available for late-night autopsies of the past anymore. "There are better creatures to study," Sam added. "Owls, for instance, or raccoons. Less likely to gaslight." The gym at 7:30 remained a confessional whose steeple was made of steel. David found an old-school trainer with forearms like bridge cables, and a voice that sounded like gravel had taken a job as a choir director. "We're going to stack," the trainer said on their first session, loading plates with the measured affection of a baker weighing flour. "But we're going to stack intelligently. Form before spectacle." The phrase snapped into place in David's body with the satisfaction of a lid fitting the right jar. Form before spectacle. He wrote it on another sticky note and stuck it above his desk, where spreadsheet cells waited like small fields of snow. Work, once a fog he stumbled through, began to feel navigable again. He blocked hours for deep focus and defended them like a small country with a well-trained militia. He took on a project that had frightened him the year before, a cross-team initiative with too many moving parts and a legacy of polite failure, and found that he could ask precise questions without apologizing for their sharpness. In meetings, when silence became a vacuum that invited bravado, he learned to let it keep breathing until someone said something useful. On the worst mornings, he put his hand flat on the desk and felt for the vibration of the building. You are held, he would think, by steel, by concrete, by schedules, by small routines that do not betray. His camera came with him almost everywhere now, not as a crutch, but as a way to keep choosing presence over projection. He photographed hands, on bus poles, on paper cups, on the leashes of stubborn dogs, on the small of a back guiding someone into a bakery as if sweetness needed a witness. He found a rhythm. Shoot during the walk to work. Edit during lunch at the corner cafe, where the barista knew how to make a foam leaf that didn't collapse under its own vanity. Print one image a week at the pharmacy, where the clerk always asked, "What are we making beautiful today?" He started a wall by the hallway, 5x7s in cheap black frames, a gallery of ordinary light that made the apartment feel like it had learned to praise without clapping. On Wednesdays, he attended a night class at the community center, Intro to Darkroom, because it felt honest to put his hands into chemicals and wait for an image to arrive from the milk-white paper like a memory that has decided it's safe to speak. The instructor, a woman with silver hair cut to practical brilliance, taught in the key of patience. Agitate, don't attack, she said, rocking a tray as if lulling a child, and watch. The image wants to be found. Your job is to stay. David thought about how many times in the last year he had refused to stay with himself when the dark got loud. In the wash, a city stoop appeared. A woman sitting, chin on fist, watching rain stipple the sidewalk. The picture felt like a self-portrait made at a distance. He wrote more, pages that would never be sent to anyone. Letters to versions of himself that had lived on either side of the worst days. Dear man on the rug, he wrote one night, the rug is not an altar and you are not a sacrifice. Dear man at the door, he wrote another, mercy is not always a hug. Sometimes it's the sentence that closes a chapter without demanding applause. He kept a small notebook for gratitude and tried, on stubborn evenings, to list 3 things without cheating. Once the list looked like a grocery store after a snowstorm, sparse, uninviting, resigned. Coffee, warm socks, not crying on the train. Other nights it spilled over with odd riches. The kid on the scooter who shouted, "I love your shoes" at a stranger and meant it. The cashier who said, "Take your time," like it was a benediction. The way streetlights make rain look choreographed. Temptation came dressed like revision. He found himself editing scenes as if tenderness added in post-production could restore what actions had dismantled. In one cut, he opened the door and welcomed her in and they talked, until dawn and forgiveness arrived like a letter with a foreign stamp. Strange, lovely, wrong address. In another, he slammed the door and called it strength, and lived for months with the sourness that self-righteousness leaves on the tongue. He closed the editing software in his head and returned to the original footage. Her face at his threshold, the sentence he chose, the gentleness of that piece. Not a performance, a boundary, no director's cut required. He saw her once across a street he didn't cross. She was with a friend he recognized from old photographs. Their heads were close in the way people's heads get when talk requires a shared climate. For a moment the air between buildings thickened, as if memory had increased the humidity. But then the crosswalk chirped, and a stroller squeaked, and the light changed, and everyone moved. He felt his heart knock at his ribs, still here, as if checking residency. He nodded at nothing. Still here, he said under his breath, and did not turn to watch her go. Boundaries, he learned, are not fences that keep wolves out so much as paths that remind him where his feet prefer to go. He stopped following her online, muted first, then unfollowed, not out of spite but because he wanted his mornings to belong to sky and coffee, and the sound of his own feet on his own floor. He told 2 friends he trusted that if they heard news, engagement, job, haircut. They should consider whether he needed to know or whether the kindness would be to let the rumor pass, like whether he didn't have to stand in. "Copy that," Sam said, his voice turning mock military so the solemnity didn't get uppity. Mara squeezed his shoulder, a pressure point of care. On a quiet Saturday, he cleaned the closet. The ring box sat high on the shelf, blue velvet scuffed at the corners where fingers had once rubbed anxiety into the fabric. He brought it down and held it like something that had stopped being a talisman and become an object. He opened it. The stone looked like a small, patient star. It didn't accuse him. It didn't ask for reassignment. "You are punctuation," he said, smiling at himself for being the kind of man who talks to mineral arrangements. "One day, if there's a sentence that needs you, you'll know where to go." He closed the box and placed it in a drawer with passports, warranties, the user manual for a blender he'd never completely understood, a drawer that promised usefulness without demanding daily attention. Sunday, he tried church. Not the kind with pews and creeds, though he liked the smell of old wood and the gossip of stained glass sunlight. He meant a farmer's market under a row of plane trees where people said, "How are you?" and then actually listened to the answer. A woman selling honey let him taste two kinds on a wooden stick. "This one's from clover," she said. "It tastes like knees in grass." He laughed, honestly, surprised by the joy of a metaphor that didn't aim to impress. He bought a jar and bread and stood at a long table where strangers ate like cousins. An old man told him a joke he'd heard before and David laughed again, not to perform community, but because the punchline arrived like a small bird landing on his wrist. He kept therapy. He liked the room, the scruffy rug that refused to match anything, the plant that seemed to be thriving on neglect, the way the afternoon light showed dust motes and made them look like a galaxy had shrunk itself to fit between the couch and the chair. "What are you avoiding?" his therapist asked once, when he'd spent 10 minutes describing the ethics of street photography to avoid the ethics of loneliness. "Grief that doesn't have anywhere to sit," he answered, surprising himself with the precision. "Make it a chair," the therapist said. "Give it legs, let it rest." He bought a second-hand armchair the next day, muted green, and put it in the corner where a tall plant might have gone, and when the ache arrived, he invited it to sit instead of pacing his ribs like a bailiff. On the night of the first snow, he walked without headphones so he could hear the hush. The city softened, outlines blurred, tires hissed with the sincerity of 1,000 sighs. He cut across the park, his boots making a new grammar. At the lake, the surface hadn't yet crusted. It breathed in small, visible ways. A couple held hands near the railing and argued about whether the flakes were really bigger under the street lamp, or if it only looked that way. "Bigger," he said quietly, like a judge issuing a merciful verdict, and smiled when they smiled without knowing why. Back home, he lit a candle and wrote 3 lines that felt like agreements and not laws. "Speak to yourself as you would to a friend who is learning to stay. Keep your rituals simple enough to survive bad weather. Choose form before spectacle." He taped the page to the inside of the cabinet door where he kept the mugs. Every morning after that, when he reached for a cup, the words looked him in the face and did not blink. He didn't always follow them. But the mornings he did, the kettle sounded like a friend clearing their throat before saying something true, and the house, which had learned to whisper his name on the night she left, learned a second word. Welcome, snow thinned to rain overnight, and by morning the city wore a sheen like resolve. David stood at the window with his mug cooling between his palms and watched the street learn itself again after whiteness. Tires whispered. A child in a puffy red coat stamped at a puddle until it surrendered its mirror. The eucalyptus on the sill held its own weather. He lifted a leaf to his nose, breathed in that clean, precise scent, and thought, "This is what honesty smells like when it finally returns to a room." The rituals held. Kettle, pour. Sip, sit. He read the small page taped inside the cabinet door. "Speak to yourself as you would to a friend who is learning to stay. Keep your rituals simple enough to survive bad weather. Choose form before." Felt how the sentences no longer tried to rescue him. They simply reminded him of where the shore was. He slid on boots, checked the closet for his umbrella, and his hand found the velvet edge of the ring box. The object was a thing among things now, not a shrine. He touched it the way one might touch a lucky stone before a long drive, not to barter with fate, but to say, "I know you're here and I'm going elsewhere." Outside, the market tents sprouted like bright mushrooms along the block. He walked slow enough to be chosen by small details. A vendor's laugh that bent the morning, steam ghosting from paper cups, a dog concentrating on not stealing a baguette. At the honey stall, the woman with the patient eyes held up a new jar. "Orange blossom," she said, "tastes like good news you didn't expect." He smiled despite himself. "Give me some of that." The taste was floral and almost audible. He bought a jar and bread and told the story in one sentence to no one in particular. "I have decided not to make the past prove anything." By the lake, the surface had started to skin in thin sheets that broke under the wind like the stubbornness of old ideas. He sat on the familiar bench and let memory approach on its own terms. When it arrived, it did not bite. It sat beside him like a difficult relative who had finally run out of speeches. He said nothing. He watched a father teach a child how to skim stones, each throw a small geometry lesson in angle and faith. On the fourth try, the stone skipped 4 times and the child shouted, "I did it," loud enough for strangers to smile. David felt the smile happen to him before he could approve it. His phone buzzed. He didn't flinch. The name on the screen made the old reflex reach for the switch that dims the world and amplifies the pulse. He let that impulse pass like weather traveling through ribs. The message was plain. Could we meet? Nothing ornate. No topic, no pleading, no ghosts attached. He typed, "Public daytime." He added the name of the old arboretum where the glass roof turned winter into a rumor and where truth tended to mind its manners. She sent a thumbs up, and for the first time since the knock at his door, he did not rehearse. He walked home, letting the walk be only a walk. At the conservatory, the glass wore the sky like a shawl, and inside the air was green with ongoing life. He found her near the citrus, small trees holding lit spheres. The smell made the tongue remember summer. She wore the coat he remembered from years when their winters were shared. Navy, a collar that could be turned up against careless wind. When she looked at him, he recognized the person and the distance and did not try to reduce either. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For choosing here. For not making this a story with an audience." They walked the loop in easy sections, letting the signage do some of the talking. He read aloud, "Mayor Lemon, Calamondon. Blood orange." She smiled at the word blood, how odd in a garden. "How are you?" she asked, that impossible, ordinary question. "I am consistent," he said. "Not always fine, often okay. Sometimes quiet in a way that feels like rest, not punishment. You." "I am learning how to be alone without interpreting it as a verdict," she said. "And how to be with people without performing gratitude I don't feel yet. I'm sorry." The apology was not a bouquet this time, it was a seed. "For what part?" he asked gently. "For the part where I wanted a grand scene to carry work I didn't want to do. For the part where I wanted you to fix my fear by being magnificent. For the part where I left and then brought the ruin back to your door like a child dragging a broken kite, asking you to make the wind behave." They paused beside a shallow pool, where koi moved in slow punctuations. He watched the fish write sentences only water could read. "I accept that," he said, and felt how acceptance sometimes felt like setting a heavy box down, not like opening it. "I didn't come to ask again." "I know. I came to tell you I'm grateful for the sentence you chose." He remembered it, 4 words that had felt like a bridge burned respectfully after checking for travelers. "It was for both of us," he said. "I couldn't keep the part of me that said yes to everything if it meant I had to keep breaking the part of me that knew when to say no." They found a bench beneath an umbrella of fronds, so vast they made their own weather. Her hands folded and unfolded in her lap. "He apologized," she said without elaboration. "It didn't restore anything. It made a different kind of quiet." "Quiets are useful," he said. "Some fit the room, some don't." He let a beat pass. "I don't need the inventory." "Thank you," she said. the relief at not having to catalog her own mess like a ledger tenderly closed. They sat until the glass roof clouded with the breath of those inside. When they stood, they did not say let's be friends, that soft lie people tell as a bandage for a wound that needs air. At the exit, she hesitated. May I say one selfish thing? You may say one true thing. You look like you've chosen yourself without making me your enemy. That is the thing I've been practicing, he said, and surprised himself by not pivoting the moment into a joke. They nodded as if to an usher who had done a job well. She left by the east gate, he left by the west. The city resumed around him. He walked without aim until his feet found the bookstore with the narrow aisles and the bell that never rang the same way twice. He browsed the essay shelf, the spines speaking in a chorus he'd learned to hear as invitation rather than assignment. A slim book about patience in craft caught his thumb. He flipped until a sentence held him. Build the vessel before you pour in the storm. He bought it. On impulse, he bought a small blank notebook with a cover the color of unripe pears. At home, he made soup with intention. Onions coaxed until sweet, carrots softened, thyme pinched from a plant he had not yet killed. He ate at the table. The second chair no longer felt like an ache, it felt like room. After, he carried his camera to the roof. The sky wore a low ceiling, pewter with a seam of light along the west where the day refused to surrender completely. He took 3 pictures. Laundry lines empty and obedient, the water tower like a stubborn punctuation mark on the sentence of skyline, his own shadow on brick, proof of proximity to light, nothing more metaphoric than that. The appointment on Thursday was at noon. He liked it then, when lunch voices drifted up from the street and reminded him that ordinary is a choir. How was the conservatory? The therapist asked, adjusting the plant that always looked on the verge of both dying and thriving. Green, he said, and quiet, and forgiving without pretending to forget. What did you learn? That my no stayed kind, he said. That what I want next isn't a rewrite, it's a new page. Describe the new page, she said. He did not talk about a person. He talked about mornings that did not ask for spectacle, about work that engaged his attention without requiring his self-worth as collateral, about a kitchen that smelled like food he chose and not nostalgia he was trying to cook back to life. He talked about friends whose presence felt like a porch light, about walks that ended at places that did not test him. He paused. And maybe, he added, a garden, even if it's just 3 pots that forgive me for forgetting to water once in a while. Write that down, she said. Make it a plan, not a wish. He did. He went to the community garden sign-up and took the last late slot in a row at the far fence where the soil was decent and the gossip was light. He met the coordinator who wore a beanie and an air of pragmatic cheer. Basil's tricky, she warned when he mentioned it. Don't drown it with love. He laughed, the old joke arriving with a gentler edge. Form before spectacle, he said under his breath, pressing his palm to the dark earth as if greeting a neighbor. The first class brought a handful of others who'd come to grow something that didn't argue back. He learned to test dampness with a finger, to thin seedlings without apologizing to the ones he pulled, to stake tomatoes before the plant remembered it would need help. He listened more than he spoke. He shared a trowel with a woman whose nails were permanently cleaned only by time. She told him which gloves actually lasted, which hoses kinked in secret, which birds would eat his strawberries and then look him in the eye as if he owed them rent. They traded cuttings like postcards. When they laughed, it sounded like a fence wire plucked into music. He did not map futures onto anyone's face. He let the days add rather than audition. On a Tuesday evening lit by that particular slant of sun that makes dust and people gentler, he walked home with a bundle of rosemary and dirt under his fingernails. He set the herbs in water, put rice on, pulled a chicken thigh from the freezer and thought, I am feeding a life I belong to. He ate at the table. He wrote in the small green notebook. Today, patience felt like a skill, not a punishment. Before bed, he opened the drawer. The ring box waited without hurry. He took it out, not to dwell, but to place it where it would stop being background, on the shelf with passports and the manual for the blender and the warranty for the camera. Paper, promises, proof of identity, instructions for making and mending. He smiled at the odd fellowship of objects. Punctuation, he said, and the word didn't need an echo. He slept without interruption. In the morning, the house met him with its learned word. Welcome. He made coffee. He read the 3 lines. He laced his shoes. On the way out, he paused, turned off the light he no longer needed, and locked the door like a person who trusts the hinges. The hallway smelled like someone's toast and someone else's detergent, and the kind of life that doesn't insist on a soundtrack. He stepped into it, not as a statement, not as a scene, but as a man crossing a threshold he had built with small, unglamorous choices, one after another, until the path looked like home. One after another, until the path looked like home.